In 2010, an independent historian sat down with a stack of 19th-century burial records belonging to one of the oldest black churches in America, expecting to confirm a few hundred names on an old map. He did not find a few hundred. He took what he found to the city. 3 years later, engineers with backhoes went looking for proof in the middle of a public playground where children were, at that moment, still playing on the swings 20 feet away. They found it 18 inches down. The researchers are not calling that shallow. They are calling it exactly what it is, barely below the surface of a basketball court, in one of the most walked-over corners of South Philadelphia. Stay with me, because what is actually still under that playground, right now, today, is bigger than almost anyone in the city has ever been told. Here is the thing about a city that built its reputation on liberty while refusing its own black residents a place to be buried. By the early 1800s, Philadelphia's free black community numbered in the thousands, by some accounts the largest free black population of any city in the country, and yet the city's existing cemeteries, controlled almost entirely by white churches and white trustees, would not reliably accept them. A free black Philadelphian could live an entire law-abiding life in the birthplace of American liberty and still have nowhere secured to be buried at the end of it. Richard Allen had already spent his life solving problems the city refused to. Born enslaved in Philadelphia, he purchased his own freedom as a young man, became a licensed Methodist preacher, and in 1794 founded Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, the first independent black-led congregation in the city, and eventually the mother church of an entire national denomination that still exists today. Within a few years, Allen would become the first bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, a denomination that grew out of that single Philadelphia congregation into one of the largest black-led religious institutions in the country. Mother Bethel itself is still an active congregation today, still rooted in the same neighborhood it has occupied since Allen's time. By 1810, Allen and his trustees had identified the next problem their congregation needed to solve without anyone else's permission: burial. In April of that year, Mother Bethel purchased a plot of land in the Southwark district at the edge of what was then the beating heart of Philadelphia's free black community and opened it as a cemetery for their own people. It may be the first cemetery in Philadelphia's history that African Americans owned outright rather than were merely permitted to use. For the next 54 years, Mother Bethel buried its own. Founding members of the church, war veterans, infants who lived only weeks, elders who lived past 100, all of them laid to rest on ground the community itself controlled, at a time when almost nothing else in their lives was under their own control. Here is what makes Bethel Burying Ground different from almost every other black cemetery of its era, and it has nothing to do with archaeology. Mother Bethel kept a register. For 54 years, someone at that church wrote down who was buried, and when, and often how old they were. A 10-month-old recorded only as Baby Colgate, who died in June of 1847. Rachel Dawson, 58 years old, buried in May of 1839. Robert Swales, 28, laid to rest in March of 1849. A man named Jacob Howard, known to his own community as Jesse, 40 years old, buried in January of 1840. If you watched the first video in this series, you already know how rare a sentence like that actually is. Enslaved and free black Americans from this era almost never appear in any surviving record by name. What survives, when anything survives at all, is usually a tick mark on someone else's ledger. An age, a dollar value, nothing more. Bethel's register exists because a black-led institution decided, on its own authority, that its own dead deserved to be written down properly, and then did the unglamorous work of actually doing it year after year for over half a century, long before anyone outside that congregation was ever going to do it for them. Buckaloo has spent the years since turning that register into something closer to a living public record than a locked archive, a growing name directory, cross-checked against city death notices and old newspaper columns, adding a handful of newly confirmed identities every time someone turns up another scrap of paper. It is not finished. It may never be finished, but it already holds more individual, verifiable names than most burial grounds like this one will ever get back. That register is the reason researchers today can attach real names, real ages, and real dates to at least some of the more than 5,000 people buried in that ground. Not a machine, not a laboratory, a church secretary with a pen and a ledger book, doing a job nobody made them do, because the alternative was letting their own community disappear from the record the same way the rest of the country was already trying to erase it. At least 1,400 individual interments are confirmed by the surviving paperwork alone. The real number is almost certainly higher. Most researchers now put the total above 5,000. Ages ranged from 1 month to 103 years old. And by the 1840s, the original plot had run out of room, so the only way the church could keep burying its own was to bring in fill dirt and go back down, stacking new graves on top of older ones, as many as 3 layers deep. Do the arithmetic on what that means for how close to the surface the earliest burials now sit. The man who eventually forced the city to reckon with what its own paperwork could no longer explain away was not an archaeologist, and he did not work for a university. Terry Buckaloo is an independent historian who had spent years combing through Philadelphia's church records, old maps, and property deeds. In 2010, during a routine round of community meetings about renovating a well-loved neighborhood playground, he brought forward what he had found, documentation that all agreed on the same uncomfortable fact: the playground everyone in the room was there to discuss renovating sat on top of Mother Bethel's old burying ground, not near it, on top of it. The reaction in that room was not immediate belief. It rarely is when an outsider tells an institution its own property has a history nobody currently working there knew about. But because the underlying claim rested on real church records and real city documents, it could not simply be waved off either. Federal preservation law requires that any government-funded construction project formally investigate the potential for exactly this kind of impact before a single shovel goes into the ground. So in July of 2013, engineers came to Wekako Playground and opened 4 test trenches along the boundaries where the old church records said the cemetery had been. They were not there to recover anyone. They were there to answer one specific question. Was Terry Buckaloo right? He was. The trenches found grave shaft outlines. They found coffin nails. In several places, they found decayed coffin wood, still holding its shape after more than a century and a half underground. In the shallowest sections, that evidence sat as little as 1.8 feet below the current surface of the playground, below asphalt, below gravel subbase, below a childhood's worth of ordinary Tuesday afternoons. The public was invited to watch. Members of a local advocacy group called Avenging the Ancestors Coalition came. So did a group of students from a nearby charter school, brought by their teachers to stand at the edge of the trenches and watch a piece of their own neighborhood's hidden history come up out of the ground in real time. At no point in that investigation did anyone expose, uncover, or disturb an actual human skeleton. That was not an accident, and it was not a limitation of the equipment. It was the plan from the start. The archaeologists were authorized only to confirm the boundary of the cemetery, not to excavate what lay inside it. And once the results came back, concluding that the burial ground was, in the investigators' own words, likely preserved substantially intact beneath the entire southern section of the playground, the city and the surrounding community faced a decision that had nothing to do with archaeology at all. Do you go further, the way researchers eventually did in Maryland and in Charleston, and try to recover names and family connections directly from the DNA of the people themselves, or do you leave them exactly where they are? Philadelphia chose the second option. A community group calling itself Friends of Bethel Burial Ground, working alongside members of Mother Bethel and local preservation advocates, pushed the city to treat the ground itself as the memorial. No lighting fixtures over the sensitive southwest corner, no new construction, no plantings that would require digging. When the city later discovered an aging water main from the 1830s still running beneath Queen Street directly through the site, the plan was not to excavate and replace it. The plan was to cap it in place and leave it undisturbed. On the theory that a broken pipe was a smaller risk to the dead than an open trench, nobody has ever run a DNA study on the people buried at Bethel. As of right now, nobody is planning to. The 5,000 or more people under that playground remain exactly as they were left because the people responsible for them today decided that was the more respectful choice. If this is the kind of history that belongs to your family and your community, subscribe now, because the next burial ground in this series is already in production. Here is what that choice actually protects, and it is worth understanding exactly what was already there before anyone made it. Unlike the ironworkers in Maryland, unlike the ancestors in Charleston, a number of the people buried at Bethel already have their names back and have had them the entire time, because Mother Bethel never let them go missing from its own records in the first place. Baby Colgate lived 10 months. Rachel Dawson lived to 58, long enough to have watched the neighborhood around that cemetery grow and change for decades. Robert Swales died at 28, close to the same age as several of the men buried at Anson Street in Charleston, more than 600 miles south, in roughly the same historical moment, whose names took 2 centuries and a laboratory to recover. Jacob Howard, called Jesse by the people who actually knew him, made it to 40. Amelia Brown died in 1813 at 26 years old, and her headstone is the only physical grave marker anyone has ever recovered from the site. Pulled from the earth during the 2013 investigation, and now the sole object standing between 5,000 people and complete anonymity. None of them needed a genetic database to hand their names back to their descendants. A church and the people who ran it simply wrote it down and refused to lose the paper for 180 years. The ground did not stay Mother Bethel's for long, and the reason is not a villain, it is a budget. By the late 1880s, the small congregation could no longer afford the upkeep the cemetery required. The city's own Board of Health had already labeled the neglected grounds a nuisance. Church leadership looked into moving all the remains to a larger cemetery outside the city, the standard solution at the time, but that too cost money the congregation simply did not have. So, in 1889, Mother Bethel sold the land to the city of Philadelphia, with everyone involved understanding it would eventually become public space. The remains were never moved. Within a decade, the site was a park. By 1950, it had grown into the full city block known today as Wicoco Playground, and for most of a century after that, generations of Queen Village children played kickball, swung on the swings, and ran through sprinklers directly above the people Terry Buckaloo would eventually go looking for. Philadelphia added the site to its own register of historic places in June of 2013. Within days of the archaeological confirmation, it reached the National Register of Historic Places in January of 2016. In 2019, the state erected an official historical marker on the sidewalk outside the playground, a small, formal, government-issued acknowledgement bolted to a post of everything the ground behind it still holds. In 2021, the city selected a permanent design for the memorial that is meant to finally mark the site properly. Granite and concrete pavers, engraved with names and biographical details pulled directly from Mother Bethel's old burial register, treated with a special coating that only reveals the inscriptions when it rains. On dry days, visitors will walk across a plain, quiet plaza. When the sky turns, the names are meant to surface. That project has been delayed for years. First the pandemic, then years of city budget and staffing turnover. As of the most recent public updates, construction was finally getting underway. Whether it is finished by the time you are watching this is genuinely something we do not know, and we are not going to pretend otherwise. What we do know is that right now, part of Wicoco Playground is still an ordinary, active public park. Children are almost certainly playing on it at this moment, on the sections that were never part of the cemetery, and a few dozen feet away, sealed, protected, and left exactly where they were placed, more than 5,000 people are still waiting for a ceremony this city has spent over a decade promising them. A historian went looking through old paperwork in 2010, expecting to confirm a few hundred names. Backhoes went looking for proof in 2013 and found it 18 inches under a basketball court. Neither of them dug any further than that, on purpose. Richard Allen bought that ground in 1810 so his community could finally control what happened to their own dead when nothing else in Philadelphia would let them. 216 years later, his community's decision still stands. Not to test them, not to move them, not to turn them into data, just to finally, properly build them the marker they were always owed.